Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this summit session titled Expanding America's Pathways Through Education. My name is Matthew Diaz, and I'm a CHCI Public Policy Fellow. But more than anything, I'm delighted to be with you today for this session. Ensuring equitable access to education is one of the foundational issues of our time. With it, we empower our current and future generations to tackle society's biggest challenges. On behalf of CHCI, I'd like to thank the Accenture and KIPP Public Charter Schools for their generous support of this session. It is my honor now to introduce you to Representative Jamal Bowen, representing New York's 16th District, which includes the Northern Bronx and parts of Westchester County, including Yonkers, New Rochelle, and Mount Vernon. Bowen was born and raised in New York City, spending his early years in public housing and rent control departments. He was raised by his mother, who supported them with their post office worker's salary. After graduating from the University of New Haven, Rep. Bowen began his career as a crisis intervention teacher in a Bronx public school and went on to earn a master's degree in guidance counseling from Mercy College and a doctorate in education from Manhattanville College. Please welcome Representative Jamal Bowen.
Peace and love, everyone. It's Congressman Jamal Bowen here. I wish I could be there in person with you all, but I'm happy to be able to join you all virtually through this short video message. I'm incredibly happy to see you all engaged and talking about an issue so close to my heart, which is education. I'm also proud to see you all discussing how our education system can support people who do not wish to pursue higher education. Central in this conversation is the role our K-12 schools can play. Our schools place us on the front lines and allow us to directly interact with students and their families, which when done right, can equip every student to succeed long-term and beyond the classroom. I founded a middle school called CASA in the Bronx. At CASA, teachers and staff were on campus well before and well after school ended to look after students whose parents had to be at work. During the day, we supported students and offered a range of activities that taught them conflict management, how to manage their time, be a team player, and advocate for themselves. These are skills that will translate throughout the rest of their lives. What we did at CASA, I want to do across this nation. My bill, the Green New Deal for public schools, would allow us to invest $1.43 trillion into our schools over 10 years to bolster our schools and support students holistically. Imagine if every kid in America learned how to grow their own food at school, or fix a leaky pipe, or broken water fountain. Imagine if every kid in America learned about climate change and about the skills and innovations we all collectively need to respond to the climate crisis. This bill would put every public school student at the center of a national mobilization to transition to green energy and a climate resilient society. They would gain firsthand knowledge of wind, solar, and heat pump technologies, energy efficiency and green building materials, microgrids and battery storage, sustainable agriculture, and much more. And through a variety of community partnerships, before and after school programs, and new curriculums, they would be exposed to opportunities in the building trades, farming community, organizing and public service, and so much more. Every skill is necessary in our society, and every school needs to equip students with the skills they will need to get by in this world and to thrive in this world, regardless of if they decide to attend college or not. When we expand schools' capacity and their ability to meet all of our youth's needs, we will create a more equitable society. That is a society where everyone feels supported and prepared to take on any venture they wish, whether that be working in the hospitality industry, starting a small business, or working in a corporate job. I am grateful for the educators in our K-12 schools currently, and am committed to working with my colleagues to support them and our students even further. Thank you for allowing me to share this message. Enjoy the rest of this summit and stay positive. Together, we can make anything happen. Peace and love. Be well.
Thank you, Rep. Bowen. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Ileana Najarro. Ileana is a staff writer at Education Week covering how race and opportunity play out in K-12 education, including highlighting the experiences of students and educators of color. She won the National Association of Hispanic Journalists Elaine Rivera Civil Rights and Social Justice Award for a series on how a Texas law would impact undocumented immigrants. Please welcome Eliana Nahara.
Hello. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to Representative Bowen and to Matthew for the introduction, as well as CHCI. Thank you so much for hosting this important summit, which I think we all agree is tackling major issues in the Latino community and the country more broadly. And sort of, this is a great opportunity to sort of throw out ideas for what are the resources that are out there to support our Latino students, but then also what's the work that remains to be done. Today's topic in this session is going to be a very important one when we think about economic empowerment of the Latino community more broadly. We're again looking at the role education plays in those future prospects for students. And our speakers today are experts on this topic, so you're all in for a treat. And just a brief reminder that if you want to continue the conversation online of what you're hearing here and in other sessions, use the hashtag CHCI Summit. All right, so I'll have each of our speakers briefly introduce themselves and their organizations, starting with Jorge.
Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. My name is Jorge Ochoa. I lead our career continuum work at the KIPP Foundation. KIPP as a whole, just our KIPP Public Schools, some information here. We are a network of 270 schools. We are a nonprofit, public charter school network. We educate across elementary, middle school and high school. Specifically, the work that I do is on our career continuum team, and so I lead what we like to call cradle to career, right? So what are the skill sets, the mindsets, the habits that our young folks need to be aware of to be able to access their post-secondary education, whatever that might be, whatever pathway that they're on, to then be able to land and secure a strong first job and upwardly mobile careers. I think I want to emphasize that last piece, right, in upwardly mobile careers. If you're part of the open plenary, we talked about the necessary need to have conversations with our communities on what does it mean to be financially free? What does it mean to actually be able to make the decisions that one needs to make? I think within that is that knowledge power, right? KIPP as a whole stands for Knowledge is Power program. So I always have to say that because we've been around for 25 years, but it's that knowledge piece, right? So how we get there. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Brenda Calderon.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Brenda Calderon. I am here in my capacity as a state board member for the Virginia Community College System. We represent 23 community colleges across the Commonwealth and work to partner with workforce, our K-12 systems, and our four-year universities to ensure that students have pathways to college or career.
Thank you both again so much for joining us. And a brief reminder that there will be opportunity for audience Q&A a little bit later on. But first, let's just dive into one of my first questions for both of you. We know that there are efforts underway to boost and support the number of Latino students pursuing a traditional four-year college degree after high school. We all know the value of that level of education. That being said, we also know that is not the pathway for everyone. It's not the pathway that's going to guarantee the quality of life that every student actually wants for themselves and for their families. So can you each talk about, especially in your respective roles, what are some examples of non-traditional pathways that should be more easily accessible and visible to our Latino students and their families? And why is it that some of these pathways aren't as visible as, say, the traditional four-year college? So what are some of those examples, and why are we still talking about them as though they're invisible pathways, or they're the alternative pathways as opposed to part of the norm? Jorge, do you want to?
Yeah, definitely. You know, what I'll open up with is the way that we think of career, right? So you hear me say, you know, we're part of the career, the KIPP Career Continuum team. Career for us means career for all, right? So when I say career, I'm not talking about students that aren't necessarily pursuing a CTE pathway, right? For those students, they are a part of that community. But for us, it is how do we educate across the spectrum to ensure that, again, they understand the skills, the mindsets and habits. But drilling in deeper right into the question here, I think for us over the past few years, we've realized that there is a need to better understand what is driving a student's desire to do what they want to do after they graduate high school, right? So what is their why? And I think for us, it is making what I like to say like the invisible visible for our students, our educators, and our families, which is how do we start with students understanding that for themselves, right? How do we get to a place where they can say, we often hear, I want to go to college, right? Or I want this type of job. And within that, there is the idea of, have we done the work to career map, right? Have we done the work to actually pathway map for our students, what that looks like? Is it coming from you want to become a mechanic because that is what your family does, or that is the connection piece there? Or is it that you want to go to college because that is what's happening within your family and that's the conversations that you have, right? And so how do we move away from the students that say, I am doing this because this is what I think is best because that's all that I know in my area, versus I want to graduate high school. I am aware that what drives my passion is helping people. I want to go into the health services field, and what are the careers within that, right? So I think we are working hard at KIPP to really begin there, right? How do we in 9th and 10th grade ensure that we are exposing our students to career clusters, right? How are we exposing our students to understanding what is it that's gonna drive you, right? And so if we actually have the conversations and help you make sense of what exists out there, then the pathway can come next, right? I think a lot of the same with our communities. It is that invisibility to what exists, right? So we anchor a lot of our conversations on the surest path forward. And yes, while we believe that a college degree can lead to financial freedom and specific pathways, that does not mean that there isn't additional pathways to support across all, right, for our students. So it was really anchoring how do we support those that have felt marginalized, right? Those that have felt that we are not doing enough for them, right? So it's just bringing to light that, and I'll share a few additional examples afterwards.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And Brenda, same question, these examples of these non-traditional pathways, but also why are they invisible to our community? And again, what are some of the benefits to pursuing these other options?
Absolutely. I'll start with a personal story. We've heard in our previous session how the Latino population is growing, how our K-12 schools are growing exponentially with Latino students and our English learners. However, we don't really see ourselves represented in government, at least for myself. Latinos represent 4% of the federal workforce, but we know that we're a significant force in the population. And I think representation matters. I think it matters that you have those connections, that you can leverage that social capital to gain entry in some of these very exclusive industries. So for me personally, I'm a proud CHCI alumni. I did the fellowship program, I won't say how long ago, but a couple of years ago, here in DC, and it was transformational. It was transformational to come here and see that our, at the time, Roberto Rodriguez, who spoke earlier, was the White House Director for Education. My boss at the time was senior counsel in the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and she was a Latina. And that was the first time I had that exposure. So I do think that there is certainly a role for internship and fellowship programs to place people in these non-traditional careers. And I think that policy is kind of non-traditional for Latinos, considering we're such a large force in the population, but only 4% in federal government. At the community college system, we're doing a lot to make sure that we're partnering with industry to ensure that we're removing those barriers for students to pursue skills and credentials they need to attain those jobs. It's a lot to ask students to stop working when they're providing for their family, or to attend school full-time when they need to work. And so part of our work at the community college system is to ensure that we are removing those barriers, that we are creating structures so that students can attend college on their own schedule, so that it isn't a financial barrier, and that they're guaranteed a job when they finish. I mean, there are industries in Virginia where we know that there are shortages, right? We hear about shortages now all the time, right? In early childhood education and nursing, for example. But at the state level, we've known that that's existed for a while. So a couple years ago, we launched the Fast Forward program, and it's a short-term degree credential program. Basically, you're guaranteed to have a job as soon as you finished. Your tuition is paid for while you're gaining that short-term skill degree. And I mean in these high-need degrees like early childhood education, welding. I mean, there is certainly a need for welders out there in the Commonwealth. And so we're doing our best to make sure that we're not only modeling, that we are making those connections with folks who wouldn't necessarily have exposures to these jobs, but also removing those barriers and meeting our students where they are.
Oh, thank you both for that. And you both kind of touched upon what I'm hoping you can elaborate on for this following question. Brenda, in particular, you talked about partnerships, right? And you talked about how it's a lot to expect of a student in high school to say, sit them down and say, what's your future? We're gonna help you plan through this now and figure it all out. But there's also, you know, to Jorge's point as well, the community involvement and the issue of knowledge and making sure that if there are any information gaps out there that you're filling them. So can you each talk about what are the steps that need to be taken, whether it's within the school systems, whether it's the counselors and the training for counselors, or whether it's public-private partnerships, both from industry, government levels, and schools all working together. What are some of the ways for us to actually close any existing information gaps and provide that level of representation and opportunities and removing those barriers for these students?
Sure. So one thing that's very unique that happened when the pandemic occurred, when we were sort of going into recession or anticipating a recession, is that normally you would see students hiding out the recession in post-secondary education. So students pursuing four-year degrees or returning to get their master's or community college. But we didn't see that happen. We saw that we basically lost a whole slew of students who would have enrolled but didn't. And so part of the work that we're doing now is to find out what these students are doing, right? They didn't necessarily go into the workforce. They didn't necessarily pursue four-year degrees. So what are these students doing? And that's not a situation that's unique to the Virginia Community College system. We saw that across the country. So first is making sure that we're finding these students. Second is creating opportunities to remove those barriers. So last year, January of 2021, I'm like in pandemic, so I feel like we all lost a year or two. We passed the G3 program in Virginia, Get a Skill, Get a Job, Get Ahead, and it's Virginia's version of free community college, where we completely subsidize the entire cost of tuition. We provide wraparound supports because we know it's not just about getting students into college, but also getting them to complete. And we also work with workforce to make sure that students have a job that's available for them. So we subsidize certain industries where we know that there is a high need. For example, IT is, Virginia provides so many folks for the federal government, contractors, et cetera. So we know that there's a need there. We know early childhood ed is a need. And so we're working to get the word out. If our students are on social media, we're on social media. We hired influencers to do like a day in the life as a G3 student in our community college system, so that we get the word out on what's happening at the community college. If they're on TV, we have ads about our G3 program. We're really trying to meet students to ensure that we're getting the word out on what financial aid is available to them, but also that a skill set, a degree, is in fact transformational. I mean, that can mean significant amount of money that you're making from one year to the next with that degree or credential.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. I think there's so many connective tissue, as I like to say, across the work that we're doing and the importance of the knowledge. I think I'm going to speak to it in two ways. We have the work that we're doing in our K-12 schools, specifically I would say 9 through 12 in our high schools, and then post-secondary, right? So we at KIPP support our alumni year 1, year 2, year 3 plus, as we like to say, whatever pathway that is. In terms of the high school side, we realized 2 years ago, similarly when the pandemic started, we needed to codify across our schools, how do we actually teach college knowledge and career success, right? How do we actually give our educators the tools, resources necessary to be able to have these conversations with students? Because we knew that the experience across our regions should not be a flip of a coin, right? We should work hard to ensure that we are providing them those tools and resources. And so because of the pandemic, because we saw that there was so much issues within the students and the way that we're going to experience our seminar courses, we launched the College Knowledge and Career Success Curriculum. We're at, I think, 60% of implementation across our regions. And what that did was, again, start with 9th. How do we get 9th, 10th, 11th, and then 12th to go through the key milestones that exist in terms of what should a young person learn across the array of critical consciousness, college and career, lenses of oppression, to be able to make critical choices, right? So as we're having these conversations nationally across what does curriculum mean for our students, we wanted to ensure that we not just have conversations across pathways, but that we had them critically, right? That we actually centered the identity and experience of our students. So on one hand, it was our curriculum. Another was partnering with U-Science and NEPRIS. U-Science is an aptitude test, goes deeper. I'm not going to give you the whole science of it. You can look it up. And NEPRIS brings industry professionals into the virtual space. And so if we heard early on, I don't know what it is that I want to do, or if I say I want to become a doctor, what type of doctor? And you say a doctor, how do we bring folks in to actually expose you to that? So what grounded a lot of these conversations was our development of our career connected learning framework, which really pushes for exposure, experience, and I would say awareness across the field of career. We ensured that we gave our regions ample opportunities to think through, if not our curriculum, if you have a curriculum in place, where does it fit in this framework, right? To really drive this idea of what the experience is for our students when they go through our high school systems. I'll say on the post-secondary side, and something that's very important is, well, what if the students that did not experience this curriculum, what are you doing then? And we drive our career programming, right? So we've partnered with a set of, I would say, 5 organizations nationally, UPro, Avenica, Basta, and Braven, I remember them all, to actually say, hey, if you are in your post-secondary path, how do we actually then support you in developing you further as you're there? Right? A lot of these programs are college-bound, and so we did the work of bringing in UPro, who also supports students who are pursuing a CTE pathway, to ensure that it is not just once they leave our doors, but also developing then what is year 1, year 2, year 3 plus, to secure that strong first job. Right? So,
Gotcha. So you were both able to explain to us some of the processes and strategies that are already in place to help fill in that information, and that's always great to hear. Bringing it back down to reality, there are still challenges that come into play when you're trying to better inform the community and students and families, and when you're trying to build out these partnerships. So for anyone in the room that is hearing this and says, oh, I want to be a part of these strategies to help improve access to these pathways, what are some of the challenges to keep in mind in this kind of work, and how have you been able to overcome some of those challenges?
I can start. Well, we know the profile of a student attending post-secondary education or pursuing a career is not necessarily the student who's graduating from, a high school, that 12th grade, and going directly into the university. We know our students are attending part-time. We know that they're working. We know that they may have families. We know that they may be parents. And we know that college is expensive, right? We know it's very expensive to get a degree, and it's just been increasing. So one is to make sure that our programs are designed to meet the needs of the 21st century student. So we offer programs at night. We offer programs where you're paid to attend college. We offer programs where you are guaranteed that you're gonna have a job and there's gonna be a connection for you. So that we're making those career and industry connections, especially for our first-gen students who may not have had that exposure, may not know, how to properly create a candidate profile. I remember the first time I was looking for a job and I came to DC and people were like, oh, just go get coffee with people. And I'm like, oh, that's great. Do I pay for the coffee? Do they pay for the coffee? Like, how does this work? How long do we structure the coffee? And who wants to talk to me, right? And I think that these are like real situations that our students are facing, right? I think it's a challenge that we are exposing students to careers that they may not be used to, or to workforce that they may not, non-traditional workforce that they may not be used to, and we need to provide students with the skills to do that. And so at the system level, we're certainly working with industry to remove those barriers so that it becomes less intimidating when it comes to join the workforce, and that we're definitely capitalizing on the fact that we do have, you know, a strong body of folks that want to advance their careers. We know that it's not only good for individual communities, for their families, but also for the entire state. It's $1 billion in lost potential wages when students don't have the skills that they need to fill the jobs currently. So it's certainly not just a community issue, but it's certainly a statewide issue.
Yeah, I love the question is like, you know, for the folks that, you know, that are sitting here with us, I think something that we're working on that I think is incredibly important is understanding the data, right? And by data meaning understanding labor market insights, right? The US as a whole is massive, right? And within each state, you have an array of information that is given across what are the in-demand careers, the jobs, workforce development, all those different pieces. We oftentimes have conversations with our students across, hey, this is the pathway that you want to go on, without us even knowing, is that really the pathway, right, that's going to get them to that financial freedom? When you ask them, what do you want, and they tell you their vision of their future, if the job or career pathway that they want to go on to caps at an X amount in terms of salary, are we having those conversations, right? So it's, I would say as an educator, right, former educator, teacher, then counselor, is understanding what does my local context say, right? What does it mean? Growing up in California, living in the Bay Area is very different than when I lived in Fresno, than when I lived in New York, than when I lived in Boston, right? I've been around the world, or not around the world, around the US, pardon me. And what that meant, right? And I didn't know that, right? Now as an adult, 20 years young as I like to say, I can make decisions based on the information that I know, right? I know that I'm not gonna move to a state if I wanna do this work because the pathways might not be there, right? So how do we start that earlier on for our young folks, and not just them, but their families, right? I think an additional challenge that I wanna name is how do we destigmatize pathways, right? When we talk about going into a pathway, what does that mean, right? How do we have the conversations with our family to say, I know that this is what you dreamed up for your child, this is what they want for themselves, right? But give them the actual information, right? Not to say, well, they said they didn't want to go on this pathway, we're going to support them to go down an alternative path, right? We don't use the term, we use progressive paths, right? This is a different pathway for them, but that's not enough, right? So how do you make an informed decision with the data that you have? Something that I want to name that hasn't necessarily been brought up, right, in the pathways that we support bachelor's, AA, associate's degree, associate's to bachelor's, CTE programs, and we also support military enlistment, right? But I want to pause there because I think for us, it is not to say that the military is not a pathway for our students, but do our students have the knowledge to be able to be aware of the way that the military has, without going deep into it, impacted the Latino community, right? And what that pathway looks like. We have students that have these conversations around, this is a pathway that I want to go on, and we often say, great, like this, no, right? We have to stop and say, what are you going to be aware of? How do you have these conversations with family members to actually destigmatize that, but also to bring in the data that you need to make an informed decision, right? I think that's where it stands for us is, are they making a decision that's based on an array of both transformational data, right? Not just transactional data, so that we can support them so they don't feel like we did not give them that chance, right? It is their future, it is their journey. I tell the students all the time, you are on this path on your own. I want to make sure that it's informed.
Thank you both. I think there's a huge power of having an informed decision, right? Having all the data points, all the information answered, and not just for the students, but as you both mentioned, the families and the broader community. A lot of these decisions are actually made in sort of a family setting, not just the student's future, and how to navigate those conversations, especially when you hit that mark of the student wants one path, the family wants another. How do you help the student move forward in that situation, but also recognizing, to Brenda's point, the realities of some of the other factors to put into perspective of where the student is coming from and what their needs are, and how to make sure you have those wraparound services to address that. So those were really my main questions for you to sort of, this broad coverage of expanding pathways. Would love to open it up to the audience if you have any questions for our speakers related to this topic of how do we expand these pathways, fill in these information gaps for our students. And I think there will be a mic going around, so if you want to raise your hand, the mic will come over to you.
To be loud.
Oh, yes.
I mean, me.
Got to project here, because we got the... We got a question over here.
Hi there, Manny Thomas from Accenture. I was curious about this issue kind of more in the lens of technology. As tech begins to emerge and expand, we're seeing an education or a workforce that doesn't have the skills to kind of be part of the current tech workforce. Or is there anything that you guys would focus on in getting Latino students, students of color, ready to be in STEM education, ready to be part of the AI and tech workforce?
Yeah, I'll speak to it from the lens of 9/12 and then post-secondary. I would say STEM is where we have focused most of our work because of both lens of women in STEM, right? What does that look like to support? But also the Latino community in STEM, and what does that look like, right? Or I would say BACWA communities in STEM. More so because of the awareness of what they think STEM is, right? And I think something that you brought up that's beautiful is oftentimes the conversation becomes Silicon Valley, right? And you want to be the CEO versus there is an array. I wish that someone told me, Jorge, you're really good at computer science, you love all of that. No one had that conversation with me, right? When I was in high school, no one had the conversation with me when I was an undergrad, right? I just knew I had to go to college and graduate. So I think that there is, the work that we are doing really centers, in the 9th and 10th grade is focusing a few lessons just on STEM, right? What is STEM? The lessons are created so a student does the following. One, there is a presentation. We either bring NEPRIS and some professionals to talk about it, and not I would say professionals that range in terms of roles, right, responsibilities, and then actually have our students do the research, right? Oftentimes they'll say, but I am not interested in any of that. I want to be a lawyer. That is fine, but I want you to actually do the research and make a decision based on, like, I watched the videos, I did the research, and it's just not for me, Jorge, right? Like, it's not my thing. That is okay. But starting early, right? How do we actually do that work? I think on our post-secondary side, some of the work that we're doing here, I have my colleague here, Margarita Moreno, who is the manager of Career Continuum, who does a lot of the work around, if we see that there is a gap in terms of post-secondary success and the education that needs to happen, where does it lay, right? And so we've surveyed our students, our alumni nationally, and have seen that a lot of them are going into the STEM field, right? So how do we partner with organizations that can provide that development post-secondary? To the extent that it's not just college, right? We have partnered with Accenture before on saying, hey, Accenture can provide for those students that are pursuing this type of post-secondary education and into the workforce, that partnership, right? So how do we continue having those conversations? We also have our alumni impact team, who is separate from the KIP Forward team that I sit on. And they are, as I like to say, centering our alumni to build for our alumni, by our alumni, for them as a whole, right? So I know as they look at career clusters, one of those is STEM, right? So how do we bring our alumni together that are in those roles to educate our alumni that are younger, right, that are on those pathways, right? So it's led by them. I can say till I turn blue, right, and they still see me as an educator within KIP versus an alumni that navigated that process and can now take them under their wings, for lack of a better way of saying it, as a whole, right? So it's enabling our communities to be able to do that work, and then our educators to know the resources and tools that are out there.
I would also add that if you're interested in tech, we have a program for you. If you're interested in STEM, we have a program for you. We understand that there is certainly a need in this industry, and that's why we're not only offering it in our system, but we're also offering it for free. And we certainly think that there's a role here for workforce partnerships, so that when our candidates do complete their degrees and do have the skill sets they need, that they can be placed into jobs. It costs about $4,000. The Society for Human Resource Management anticipates to hire an individual. We know that our students that are graduates of our program have a unique skill set and can be placed in an immediate need. And so that is something that our system is focused on, ensuring that we're not only subsidizing the cost for college, but also ensuring that once students finish, that they can attain a job.
Okay. Do we have another question from the audience? I think our mic is working. We have somebody here.
Hello, my name is Gabriela Prudencio, and I am a freelancer and an entrepreneur. And my question is on the intersection of health and pathways. To what degree is health right now integrated into the conversation of pathways? Two specific things I'm thinking about is not just the mental and the physical health of the student, but also the family. With the issue of caregiving, students may not be able to pursue the pathway that they want. And I just welcome both of the panelists to take this question based on your experiences. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I'll speak on the post-sec side of what we do. When COVID hit, right, like I'm gonna name a thing, right? When COVID hit, we saw the deep need for mental health and wellness for our alumni. The reality is mental health and wellness has always been needed by our alumni, right? This is not just because COVID exacerbated an issue that we knew was there, especially because the majority of our students are BIPOC leaders in the community. So we early on partnered with Ayana Therapy. Ayana Therapy, for those that, if you heard of or not heard of them, centers BIPOC therapists and connects them with students that need that support, right? So we are supporting about 250 alumni right now to get that support, that level of access, free of cost to them, right? So we at a national team provide that. Recruitment's not the right word, right? But we make aware our regions of that support, because we know, especially when we talk about specific career clusters, that the STEM, again, right? We're gonna go into STEM, anxiety and what that means, right? Just going through the pathway, but also the jobs that you have. So that is one thing that we are doing on the post-sec side, is offering that one-to-one support. Now that isn't to say that that's scalable, right? We have thousands and thousands of alumni, and so how do we actually do that on the high school side, right? And so we're providing, in partnership with our regions, training for our counselors on how to actually support mental health and wellness as a counselor, right? How do you center that? What does culturally responsive counseling look like? But what does mental health and wellness look like in terms of conversations that you have, right? So I think we're trying, right? I can't sit here and say that we've figured it all out, because when we think of numbers, we're not there yet. But at least we can speak of what we're learning and what we're hoping to learn from the pilots or partnerships that we have right now. Yeah.
And I'll also add, it's not just a matter of getting students into systems, but also supporting systems. And I'll speak from, my personal experience is that guilt, the Latino guilt that your parents, like for physically moving out, or for, wanting to do something that they may not agree with, or they may not wish for you. Those are real challenges that our students are facing. And so when we talk about serving a whole student and fully serving students, it's not just making sure that their financial aid is taken care of, or they're signed up with the registrar, et cetera, et cetera. It's making sure that we're meeting all of their needs, and some of those may be cultural as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question. And we have another one here.
Good afternoon. Take this mask off. This question is for the panel and I guess anyone in the room. My name is Craig Adams. I'm a small business owner. I'm a State Farm agent. I have some of my peers in the room as well with me. My question for you guys is, how can someone outside of your community who wants to help you guys and be a partner with you guys, what is the first step? Because I know for myself, where my office is located, my community, the Spanish community, you know, you guys are very visible, and not just serving you guys, having employees, and I know the company that I represent, even the church that I go to, and other individuals that I know who have private organizations. We want to be there for you guys. We want to be a resource for you guys. What can we do? What is the first step? Who can we contact? What type of organizations? That's why I'm here. Yeah. So I want to do whatever I can to help you guys. So that's really my biggest question. Thank you.
I'll speak in the eye, right? I can't speak for, you know, our partner orgs that are here. This is a conversation, right? So like the person would be me, right? Like, oh, I'll see you afterwards to be like, hi, how you doing? But it's just that entry-level conversation, right? Of what is it that you're offering? How does it, I think something to name is, how does it align with our mission and vision and how we support students, right? I think the first question that I always ask is, for students that enter any partnership, is it upwardly mobile, right? Like we want to support partner organizations in having students placed into those careers. And the first question that I will ask is, what does upward mobility look like, right? What does upskilling look like? And that map, right? Does it align for students as a whole, right? So, but it's always a conversation, right? We've learned over the past few years that there's so many orgs out there that do this work, right? And so sometimes the issue is not the inability to find orgs, but the ability to find time to connect with everyone, right? So how we do that work. So the person that I was connect with, right there in front of you, they'd be like, hello, to just start there, right? And that's what I always recommend, right, is to kind of give out the hand and do a handshake and say, hey, I heard this is the work that you're doing. This is how we can support your students, right? And then we go from there and see if it's a good fit. Yeah.
Yeah, at the system level, certainly local workforce boards are the go-to for industry and making those connections for our community colleges and for our students.
Right. Look at that networking happen. This is the great thing about these summits, right? Any other audience questions? We have one over here on the side.
Hi, my name is Isabella Paz. I'm a CHCI Nutritional Health Graduate Fellow. And my question is, for undocumented students, what support do they have specifically in high school when they want to go to college?
Yeah. I'll focus on college as the question. I would say, one, I'll speak personally, right, before I say this. I was born and raised in Mexico, undocumented till I was 17. It was more happenstance from my father that became a citizen, and I naturalized through him. But I had a mentor when I was in high school that kind of walked me through the whole process and said, hey, this is what Jorge wants to do. You need to get your ducks in a row, try to support him this way. He, on his end, was going to apply to the Gates Scholarship, the Dell Scholarship Program, and I'm like, there's no way that Jorge, small town, Northern California, from Mexico, will get this. I ended up getting both scholarships, right? So it's information dissemination, right? And so we at KIPP as a whole, that is the question that we ask every single time that we have conversations. We have a post-secondary match team. The match team really develops the counseling practices, the frameworks on how you have conversations with students and families. And the team is always well aware how does this translate to undocumented students, right? So we've partnered with organizations before when we do financial aid. So we partner with USpire a lot, and so we actually have the conversations with our families on this is what financial aid means. If you're undocumented, this is the process that you take. When it comes to partner colleges, we have those conversations. We are partnered with, don't ask me the number, but dozens of colleges across, right? And I'll name the privilege in being a part of KIPP is that we have those partnerships. But we ask those questions of our colleges, right? For undocumented students, what is the financial aid package that you give? To your point, I think it's important. What is the mental health and wellness support that you give, right? What is the career resources that you give as a whole, right? So we have a practice at KIPP where when we make decisions designed to the margins, right? Like equity in mind when we make decisions, and we always think of those students first, right? So it's not to say, and I think what's challenging is that state by state, it differs, right? Like we know that there are California versus Massachusetts versus Florida versus Texas versus Indy in the area, it's going to be very different, right? So we have our community of practice leaders that also support across giving information, leading those spaces to better support students, right? So I think the long answer to this is we are aware and we have the conversations, and I think what I'm proud of is that we have leaders within KIPP that are either documented, right, or have been undocumented, or still are undocumented, right? And live, luckily live in a state where they can do the work there, but just being mindful and aware, right? And actually doing the research to understand how does policy change, what does it mean for us as a whole?
And I would say there's certainly a role for partnerships as well. Like we know our undocumented students face additional challenges because they don't qualify for federal financial aid, right? And so all the stimulus funding that went out in the last couple of years, unfortunately they didn't get to benefit from that. But we do know that there is a role for the private sector as well in our foundation. So when COVID hit and all this relief was going to our students, our post-secondary students, our foundation, the Virginia Community College Foundation, stepped in to assist our Dreamer students because they too were going through challenges. They too were going through the pandemic, and unfortunately they weren't able to receive some of the federal aid that was available to other students at the time.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Any additional audience questions?
Hello. Jorge, don't be nervous. I'm Danny Zendejas, Director of Career Readiness, KIPP Texas Public Schools. I have a comment / humble brag that'll lead into a question, but one thing I want to acknowledge is that as a community, we should continue to challenge ourselves, right, to the highest bar possible. Something we can all do is check ourselves on our language and communication choices. So I appreciate that we've been doing that, right? Because I think we have cultural biases that we have to get over, right? So like talking about alternative options, they're not alternative, right? Things like that. And we don't have traditional ways of doing things anymore. We have to open our mindset. So there's that. One, I want to thank Accenture. I know they're a mutual partner. One thing that we were able to do this year in Houston was we have our first class of college-age alumni getting full paid internships at $24 an hour. They just happen to be all Latino and Latina, and one of them is a student that just got DACA right before he graduated and wasn't able to get an internship before he graduated. So I asked Accenture, I'm like, hey, can we make an exception and give him an internship? And so he did, so hey, Ben. But that leads to my question, and it's for everybody on the panel, but how are we innovating and how are we challenging our biases and the ways we've looked at things before? And maybe what are some ways that we're not quite doing it yet, but we need some innovation in this space to help our students bridge those disparate gaps?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Danny. He's like, don't be nervous. I'm not nervous. I appreciate Danny. I appreciate Danny very much. I would say a very hyper-focused way to answer this on our end is we're here to talk about pathways, right? Progressive pathways, specifically when I think about CTE for students that are pursuing a CTE pathway, right? And you hear me say that and pause for a second because you often will hear folks say CTE-bound students or CTE students. Students are not that title, right? They are a student pursuing a pathway, right? And I've been pushed on that, so I always think it's important to be vulnerable and share, right? The way that I grow in terms of my own role. When somebody says, hey, Jorge, great, and here's a tweak, right, for you as an external partner. We are right now focusing a lot of our research on figuring out the following question, which is, what are the skills, habits, mindsets, right? But the key milestones to support a student who is pursuing a CTE pathway 6, 12, 18, and 24 months out of, right, to a strong first job, right? The reason that I think that's innovative and important is we're having conversations, again, across, you are gonna go into this pathway and you're gonna graduate without having the conversations of, so what are the skills that you're building, right? What do we know from industries, from the labor market that says, hi, Google, right? It's always thought Google's always brought up. Google, what are the skills that you're looking for, right? And how do we backwards map to that, right? So actually doing the research to understand, is it still true that every student needs to know how to write a resume? right? Maybe on these pathways, yes. Definitely how to interview. That is not going to go away, right? So what are those inflection points? And then how do we backwards map to actually say, are our programs, is our curriculum, is our advising, and our education sector and our advising counseling sector actually teaching those skills, right? Because if we say that you must enter, even KIPP as a whole, right, with X amount of skills, but our own students can't name that they've learned how to do those skills, did we actually do our job, right? So it's actually holding ourselves accountable and responsible for the outcomes that our students have, right? So I would say is defining, as an example, those skills. What are the skills, right, that we need to know?
I would just add is embedding our students and their needs into our work, into our strategic plan, such that it's not an afterthought, it's built into how we are designing our systems, how we are designing our programs. So we launched Opportunity 2027. It's our strategic plan for the entire community college system. And we're looking at the profile of our students. We're looking at the challenges that students are facing now as a result of the pandemic. And we want students to not only recover from the pandemic, but to thrive. And to thrive in their unique communities, and to make sure that we are closing achievement gaps, that we're providing opportunities for our students, and that we're creating programs for our non-traditional students, which are actually our traditional students. And what does that look like in the 21st century? It's really understanding the data and the demographics across the Commonwealth, and making sure that our programs are reflective of those students, and that we're creating those opportunities for students to pursue, whether it be a degree, a credential, a trade, et cetera.
Oh, thank you both for that. And we had another question here.
Hi, thank you so much for your panel. I'm Jocelyn. I work for Young Invincibles. I have a question about incarceration and your work with inmates, specifically with about 30% of those incarcerated being Latino. So just knowing what pathways to education or workforce you provide for individuals that are incarcerated to facilitate their transition into society.
Yeah, I love the question. I see snaps in the back. And I think the reason that I think the snaps are important is because I can name, and again, vulnerably, we're not. Right, and by I mean we're not is, we haven't been asked that question, right? And to not be asked that question, that means, are we then thinking through who our alumni are, right? And I think we do have alumni that have navigated that space specifically, right? So what I can commit to on my end is to bring the question back, to say, hey, it is not gathering the data. I don't want to say sure. I'm sure, some say I'm sure, I'm not sure. I am confident that within the regions we have students that have navigated that path, that have come back and we've supported them, but we don't have the data that shows what that has been, right? So the commitment on our end is, if we have and are building these structures to support, what does it look like for our most marginalized, right, of individuals that have gone through the system? And I think something that it's important to name is that we know that oftentimes the reason that organizations might say we don't is because, if it's a violent offender, and that's not the reality, right? We know that who gets incarcerated and the reasons they get incarcerated for. I'm very open to say I have a misdemeanor for trespassing, y'all, because I trespassed at Disneyland. Right, and I have to actually share that every time that I apply for a job. But if you would just look at the record, right, you would say, wow, he has that side to him. And I'm like, no, it's because I wouldn't leave the store. Because they were arresting my friends and they said that they were shoplifting when they weren't, right? So if no one gave me that opportunity, right, what would that mean? So I really deeply just appreciate the question to hold ourselves accountable to that, so, yeah.
And I agree, this is not an area where I am necessarily an expert in, but certainly more advocacy around second chance Pell and Pell for prisoners, and making sure that there are financial resources available to students who wish to pursue post-secondary degree or credentials while they're serving time.
What I can add, I know we're almost at time, I can connect with you afterwards. There's an organization out of Boston that does a lot of that work. I was on their board for a bit. And the way that they provide services and support in terms of reinstating and coming back into, right? So again, the skill building, what does that look like as a whole? So we can connect afterwards, because I think what at least can offer is here's an org that is doing it, right? In terms of just information dissemination. Yeah.
No, well, again, thank you all so much for your questions. This conversation could keep on going, but I want to make sure that our speakers have very brief, any closing main takeaways you want to share before we wrap all this up?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I can share at the end is the work that I do daily is to remember the humanity of who we do the work with, right? Not do the work for, but who do we do the work with, right? And so I think it's important to go back to, in just the same way that I'm doing right now, is to say, if I sit in a position of power or authority, if I sit in a position where I can influence decisions, how am I bringing these questions back to my org, right? How am I asking who are our most in need, who are our most in whatever, to then have those discussions, right? And I think what I can offer up is networking, right? You all are a part of an organization, part of, here as a collective of really amazing individuals, right? I always say when folks say, hey, this is the work that we're leading at a national level, if you want to look at what it looks like locally, please go see Danny in terms of the work that he's doing in KIPP, Texas, right? I know now to be able to go to partners and say that, right? So see the humanity and build that partnership, right? And build those connections when you can.
Yeah.
I would say, I feel like I sound like a broken record, but certainly meeting students where they are, right? Yep. So making sure that, whether, if it is a 4-year degree, that we're supporting that and encouraging that. If it's something that a student wants to gain a credential or a quick degree, that we offer those programs available, because there's certainly a need for that. And it's not just a matter of getting students into their programs or to post-secondary education. It's also supporting students while they're there, so that they can complete their degree or credential or whatever it is that they're pursuing, but also without sacrificing, whether their familial responsibilities or their jobs, et cetera, so that we're not retrofitting our systems, that they are in fact designed with our students in mind.
Well, thank you again to our fabulous panelists. Thanks again to our audience for your engagement here today. This was such, eye-opening discussion, as we mentioned, sort of how we have these conversations too, the language we use, and how we're thinking about equity in the work that we're doing here. Love to hear all this. Thank you all so much for your time. And I believe if you want to learn more specifically on empowering the Latino middle class, there is a session going on in the forum after this one. So thank you all again so much for your time, and thank you to our panelists.